Hello? My name is Gus, and I'm here to talk about the history of progress. Because it's from me, it's going to be a technical talk. I'll tell you some of the history and a few lies also. You may have seen this quote before, and I think it's appropriate. George Santayana was an American philosopher who wrote a book where he said this. And it's true. A lot of people have contributed material to this presentation. Some of them are no longer with us. So here's the whole story. After this slide, we can all go home. So Progress started generating revenue in 1985, a little bit in 84, but not much. And it's grown steadily for quite a while. There's a big dip, 2008 and after, but it's been increasing after that. Part of the dip here is because Progress sold off some of the companies that it had acquired and then started a different acquisition strategy with different kinds of companies. Instead of roadkill, they acquired successful companies. So before Progress started, there was another company that was called Mitrol. And Mitrol was a company that was started by a gentleman named Harold Adler. They made manufacturing information systems, MRP systems, for mainframes, IBM machines. And some of the people that worked there thought that they should make a version for PCs. But the company got acquired by General Electric, and General Electric said, nah, you're not doing that. So they said, okay, see ya. So Mary and Chip and Clyde went off to start a new company, which was incorporated in December 81. They got Joe Alsop to come in and be the president and a fundraiser and do marketing. That was a guy they knew. Chip was a student of Harold Adler's, and that's how he got involved in Mitrol. Anyway, so there were 4 founders. Mary technically was employee number 1, but she was really a founder. And there was another guy, Jeff Stamen, who was going to be one of the founders, but at the last minute, he said, I can't do this. I got to go have a job. I have kids to feed and so on. Can't afford it. So he went and did something else. Much later, he came and joined Progress and worked there for a while. According to Joe, the initial funding that they started with was about $450,000 in 81. Then they went off and started working on version 1. One of the things they fought about for a little while was, what language should we use to write the product in? There were a couple of choices. There was assembler, which was predominant in PC software at the time. There was Pascal, and there was a little bit of C. But that wasn't a popular choice at the time. There weren't very good C compilers for PCs at the time. I know this because where I worked, I had to use one, and I was appalled at the quality of it, because I was used to working on mini computers that had real compilers. Anyway, they finally decided to write it in C, mainly because that's what Clyde thought was the right thing to do, and the other ones agreed. So they started working. Chip and Clyde were busy arguing over the language, and Joe was off raising money and looking for investors. So Mary worked on the compiler. To start with, she had no machine. So she was using pencil and paper to lay out the structure of the compiler, and she had it all spread out on her desk at home. And then eventually, they bought her a PC so she could work on a computer. So she had a computer that had a floppy disk, no hard drive, and that was kind of painful. Anyway, so they built version 1, and they demoed it at this trade show called Comdex in November. At that time, the name of the product was Spectrum. And it was a big hit there, but because of the lack of money, they used Mary's daughter as the demo person. And Glenn Meter, yeah, who volunteered. Here is a scan of the user guide for version 2.1. I posted this onto communities a long time ago. It ought to still be there, but I haven't looked for it. Anyway, you can see at the top there the Data Language Corporation logo for the product, because in 1984 they decided we're not going to call it Spectrum. We're going to call it Relational Data Language. And then they decided to call it Progress. So the logo that's there stayed roughly the same for quite a while. Here's the preface for the user manual, the beginning of it telling you what it is. And then there's a couple hundred pages of instructions, all in this typewriter font. Okay, so they shipped on August 8th, 1984, which was Joe Alsop's daughter's birthday. They had originally planned to ship in January, but they ended up being behind schedule. Unsurprising. At the point where 2.1 came out, there was no .rs. Everything was a session compile, so when you compile the source text, it was all, the executable code was all in memory. Here's a rough, simplified architecture diagram of the major pieces. So there was a front end and a rudimentary editor, a compiler, and the interpreter that ran the code, compiled code, a database. Then there was communication between client and server. So the very first version was client server. However, the client and the server had to be on the same machine. But for Unix machines, which is what the first release was on, that was okay because the interface was done with terminals, and Unix machines were pretty good at having multiple terminals plugged into them. So the client program ran on Unix machine, but the human who was using it was in a terminal that could be somewhere else. So that was acceptable at the time for a little while. So then in version 2.3, we got R code. So a bunch of changes were made to include this R code manager that was able to load R code from disk, and the compiler would write R code to disk, of course. So, and you still could do session compile, so you could still run a .p just like before. And then there were some other bits and pieces. But the architecture wasn't really changed much at that point. The R code was size limited to 63 KB, which means that the program that you compiled, the compiled output couldn't be bigger than 63K. At the time, that seemed like a okay size limit because the PCs were small and the Unix machines were small too. So then we get to version 3. And then we have networking added. That was the big feature in version 3. So you could use NetBIOS or you could use TCP/IP, but not both. You had to pick one. Then there were a bunch of 4GL improvements, added a few new statements and stuff. Find previous was a big one. And then they started on index compression. So before that, the indexes in the database were uncompressed. The compression scheme got improved a bunch of times over the years. And then there were ports to various other Unix machines. So we got, in the beginning, there was the DOS and YCAT, because Mary did the development on DOS, and they got a YCAT machine to do the Unix version because that's what people wanted to buy at the time. And then a bunch of other Unix machines came along, and the list of machines got bigger and bigger over the years. So at version 3 in 1986, this is what was supported. And then the version 3 architecture. So there were a bunch of improvements to the front end to make it more amenable to fancier screen designs. And then you can see here there's buffer manager and schema cache and field manager code that was part of the client. Those modules, you may have seen references to them. The letters there are BF, SC, and FM, you may have seen in stack traces, because a bunch of the internal names for various pieces of the C code had groups of C functions with two characters in the beginning of the name to identify what part of the architecture they belong to. So there was a whole set of modules of various kinds in the internal architecture. Database manager had a whole bunch of similar naming schemes for different parts. So there was the before image writing module and the record manager and so on, and index manager. And then we got a few more network modules added at the bottom there. But overall, the architecture didn't really change much. It just got a little bit fancier here and there. Anybody here use a Y60 terminal? Yeah, everybody did pretty much in those days. And then, of course, there was VT52s and VT100s that came along after. So then, 87, we come to version 4. At that point, they changed the company name from Data Language Corporation to Progress Software Corporation to match the product name. In some respects, the choice of using the name Progress had some drawbacks, but those drawbacks were not apparent at that time because there was no internet. Well, there was internet, but most people didn't have access to it. And there was no search engines and stuff like that. So the problem showed up much later when people tried to search for Progress, and you search for Progress on Google, and you get a billion hits, but none of them are what you were looking for. Okay, so in version 4, we get this heterogeneous networking, which means you can use different network protocols together at the same time if you want to. And then we get a redesign of the before image log, and we get after imaging. That's a new feature that got added in version 4. And then multi-volume databases. At this point, before version 4, the database had to be contained in a single file, which was not too much of a problem because on the PCs, you probably had floppy disks and maybe a 5 or 10 megabyte hard drive. So a 2 gigabyte file was unheard of at the time. I happen to remember the first customer who eventually got to the 2 gigabyte file size limit. And at that point, we had made some code changes to make the file size limit 4 gigabytes, but nobody had 4 gigabytes worth of disk space, so there was no way to test it until his customer eventually did. That happened, I think in version 4, but it might have been version 5. Anyhow, so a bunch of improvements in version 4 besides the redesign of before imaging and after imaging. And the architecture evolved a little bit, but not too much. Then in version 5, big changes. Now, we added support for shared memory. I say we, but I wasn't there yet. Multiple server processes was a big feature. Up until this point, there was a single server process that served all the clients, and that, of course, became a bottleneck when you had too many clients. And then somebody invented this idea of, let's take the client code and the server code and put it together in the same executable. So we have self-serving clients that got added in. And that provided a big performance improvement compared to network clients because the communication between the client and the server was, instead of network messages, it was subroutine calls. And at that point, networks were pretty slow compared to now. Also, SQL got added in. At that time, strangely enough, Progress had the first NIST-certified SQL processor for SQL 86, which was the standard at the time. Then we added more network protocols and more operating systems. And the architecture got more complicated now because we had this shared memory. And multiprocessor machines were beginning to become available to the general population, which meant that we had to have mechanisms in shared memory to manage access to the same data from multiple processes at the same time. So concurrency was a big problem that had to be solved at that point. Now, up to 1988, here's a list of 25 developers, the first 25 developers who worked for at least a year. You may recognize some of these names. The question is, which of these people are still working at Progress? Anybody know? Yeah, Tim Sargent, he's the only one. Okay, then, 1989, I came to Progress. So did Mike. He beat me by 3 weeks or so. So how did I get connected with Progress? Well, I worked at another company in Massachusetts, and 3 of us who were working there had this idea to start up a software product, and we were looking for funding. So we were going around visiting various people in companies in Massachusetts, all these people that we knew or that we got introduced to by friends. So we're going around taking all these people to dinner and talking to them and looking for interest in our idea. And one of the people we got together with was Chip Ziering at Progress. I didn't know anything about Progress at the time. We were just looking for funding. So we took Chip out to dinner and talked to him for a while, and he eventually said, well, not interested. This is not something for us to be doing. We have a different kind of business that we're in. So off we went. 3 weeks later, he calls me up and he says, hey, why don't you come in for a job interview? We're looking for people. So I go see Chip and talked to him for a while. I talked to Clyde. So he hired me. So here I am. So at the time that I went to work there, Progress had about 130 employees total. The development organization was about 20 or so people, which included IT. IT was part of development because the development organization was the only part of the company who had computers. All the salespeople and others had terminals. A few people got these sewing machine-sized cases with portable computers after a while. But at the time I joined, there weren't any of those. Anyway, so Mike was part of the IT department at the time, and which was 3 people. Only 2 of them actually did anything, Mike says. Anyway, so at that point, the company was at 5 Oak Park in Bedford, Massachusetts, and they cleared out a storage closet for me to have as an office. So when I first started there, I spent a lot of time talking to Mary C.K., who was explaining to me how things worked and how the whole software architecture was set up and so on. And I spent a few months reading all the source code, and eventually I learned enough to be useful. So while I was doing that, I was disappointed because there was no email. The company I worked at before, we worked on a big fax machine, and the fax machine had email. So within the company, we could send emails to each other, and we were used to doing that in the development organization. But when I got to Progress, there was no email. So I set up email, and at that point, there was no internet access at Progress either. That came shortly afterwards, but at that time, we didn't have internet. So the email system's contact with the outside world was because we set it up so that the email machine would call a machine at MIT twice a day and collect mail, and another machine at MITRE. So that was how we got email and sent email as well. Twice a day was enough at the beginning because nobody there was using email anyway, except me. And then I convinced Clyde and a bunch of other people to start using it. So the development organization started using it to communicate amongst themselves, and then it spread to other parts of the company. Anybody remember this logo? That was the logo for version 6. That was designed by some outside company that had these logo designers. And I remember this meeting Chip had. We used to have these weekly lunch meetings where we'd sit on the floor outside of Chip's office and eat lunch. And so Chip got the logo designers to come and show us the brand new logo. And I remember them explaining to us the meaning of this logo and how it made you feel and all this stuff. Complete nonsense. But that was the version 6 logo it was in all the documentation. So then we come to version 6.2. That had major database changes. The first big one being the idea of federated databases, which means your application could connect to several databases at the same time and use the customer table in one database and the orders table in another if you wanted to. But that also introduced several problems, one of which is that transaction consistency had to be maintained across databases. So we implemented two-phase commit between the Progress databases using a communication protocol that was not standardized. There were some other products out in the world that had two-phase commit as well, using their own protocols. Everybody had their own different communication protocol. The logic was all the same, but for how you do two-phase commit, that was well understood. But how the client and the servers communicated with each other was all proprietary. Then we also came up with the first gateways. So we had federated databases, and then we also provided access to foreign databases, which started out as Oracle version 5. And then on the VAX machines, we had this thing called RMS, the Record Management System, and we provided an interface to that on VMS. And then a bit later to the database on VAX that was called RDB. So at that point, we provided access to the foreign databases, and we called them foreign databases, but we didn't support all of the functionality of the 4GL for each database at that point. The foreign databases, they went through these gateways that implemented some of the access mechanisms that the 4GL needed, but not all. So then there was some stuff in the 4GL that we added, so you could query the database to ask it what features were supported and which ones weren't, and you'd get back an answer. So the idea was that you could write a program in the 4GL that behaved slightly differently depending on what it was connected to. That was the concept. It was not a practical idea. Nobody wanted to do that. What the customers wanted, at this point, they didn't really care because this was a brand new feature nobody was using. But after they'd used it for a while, they said, we're not going to do this, behave differently for each type of database that we're connected to. It has to work the same for all of them. So eventually we had to make some changes to accommodate that. But at this point, we're just getting started with foreign databases. So customers had no experience with it, and we had limited experience with it. More ports. And so at this point, version 6.2 eventually ran on over 100 different operating systems. We had this big room that was full of machines that the porting group used to do the ports on and to test them before we shipped releases for them. And one of the machines that we did a port for was special. It was Mike's favorite. Manny DeSilva's favorite. Sorry. I forgot to put the picture in here. The Adiza was a machine that was made in Brazil.
They were the IBM of Brazil.
Yeah, it was actually a big company in Brazil, and they sold a lot of machines, and they wanted to have Progress running on their machines because they thought that would increase sales if people in Brazil would write applications in the 4GL. At that time, there weren't too many choices for what you wrote business applications in. So the 4GL was an important choice for people. Anyway, so the Adiza was a Unix machine. However, the Brazilians had translated everything into Portuguese. So all the error messages, all the man pages, a bunch of commands, lots of stuff got converted from English into Portuguese. There was no networking, which we were used to solving that problem because there were other machines that we had ported to that didn't have networking, or we didn't have networking on our machine. Even though that was a possibility, we got cheap machines from the companies that we did the ports for. Anyway, so, of course, nobody at Progress spoke Portuguese except for one person. This guy named Manny DeSilva, who was from the Azores. So he was supposed to help with this port. I wasn't involved in the port. I remember it happening, but...
Can I tell a quick story about it?
You may.
So the reason why we had to get Manny involved is their compiler could only recognize unique characters up to 7 characters. So you got to imagine that all the C functions, all the variables, they weren't unique but beyond 7 characters, right? So we're asking...
Right, you could have longer names, but it only cared about the first 6.
So we're asking them, how do people work with this? Because, we have a large software product, Manny, can you, because I'm responsible for doing this port, and so I asked my friend Manny, can you talk to them? You speak Portuguese, you're from the Azores. He's an immigrant, so his parents speak Portuguese. So he gets on the phone with them, and it's clearly not going the way it's supposed to go. And he starts, instead of speaking Portuguese, he just starts speaking English loud and slow. I could have done that, Manny. You're not helping. So what they did is they gave us a program, a C program that they gave us that would parse our source code and keep track of all the variables and functions, and it would put a number in front of it. So that means that the number would make it unique. So the source code became completely unreadable because you'd be looking for a function that you'd know, but the function now has 7 or 8 characters, sometimes 9 characters in front of it before it has the function name. And that was not just functions, but variables and everything. So we got the port done, but it was completely unsupportable. It was a port that the bugs that were in the product were the bugs that were in the product. There was no chance of fixing it.
Yeah. So there was another fun port that we did. Data General had a machine that they paid us to do a port to. That was, I think it was an Eclipse, or later version of the Eclipse machine. Anyway, so one of the things that was a requirement for our code to successfully work on these machines was the ability to do shared memory locking. And the Data General machine didn't have a way to do that. And we struggled and struggled and struggled trying to come up with a solution to that, and we never did. So they paid us to do this port, and we never finished it.
And they told us to keep the machine.
Yeah, right, because the machine that we were porting to got replaced by a more modern machine afterwards, which we did do a successful port to, but they let us keep the Eclipse machine. All right, so here's the data server part of the architecture. So now what we've done is introduced this thing called a data server DBIM, database interface module. And what that did was it had a set of functions in it that were similar to the functions that the 4GL used to communicate with the progress database, but they were hand-coded to do something to another kind of database. So there would be a version of that code for the Oracle database. There'd be one for the RDB database. There'd be one for Sybase, one for each of the different types of databases that we eventually supported. So the DBIM did that, plus there was a DBIM for the progress database as well. So that layer got added. And then there was, inside the networking code, there was another layer that did the network protocols. So there was a version of networking code for SPX, IPX, another one for DECnet, TCP/IP, and name pipes, and so on. So that was how we managed those different types of connections. So part of what made the data server or gateway architecture work was we had this thing called a schema holder, which was a progress database that had names and definitions for tables and fields in the foreign database, because the foreign database might have had a naming scheme that was incompatible with the 4GL, because the names that you could use in the 4GL for variables and fields and stuff used a certain character set, but in the foreign database, they might have used some other scheme. And so the names had to get translated from back and forth in order for things to work properly. Same with data types. Data types were not really standardized at that point. They were evolving, but you couldn't always rely on a data type in Oracle working exactly the same as a data type in the Progress 4GL. So there had to be a mapping layer to do that as well. And the schema holder database is where that information was kept. So when you compiled a 4GL program, it would look at the schema holder to learn what the tables and columns were. Okay, the federated database, now it had support for two-phase commit for Progress databases, and then we had this cheesy two-phase commit for combinations of databases that included non-Progress databases. So you could do two-phase commit between Progress and Oracle, and it sort of worked. At this point also, we started changing the idea of gateways to data servers. The name change was made because that was part of, let's make the database interfaces all work the same so people don't have to change their code for Oracle or for Sybase or whatever. So here's another version of the architecture at that time that has slightly more detail on the DBIMs. Okay, so 1992, we released version 6.3, which had a major shift in the architecture of the database. The 4GL didn't change at all between 6.2 and 6.3. But the database internals changed a lot, motivated by improving performance. That all started because one day Chip came to me and he said, we have this benchmark, it's called the TP1. And I said, what is that? I've never heard of that. And he said, well, I want you to take a look at it because we've done some experiments with that benchmark and the results are really appalling. We get terrible results and I would like to know why. So I started looking at it. And eventually I figured out some things and we came up with some improvements that we put in version 6.3. And so that was when APWs and BIWs and AIWs got added, was in that release, and they've been in the product ever since. Altogether, the different things we did had a significant improvement in performance. And we did a benchmark with Sequent on a test machine that they had in New Jersey, and then produced a big white paper that we published with the benchmark results. That was something that was starting to become an expected thing if you had a database, was you had to have published TP1 benchmark results. So we did that. Here's a rough summary of the database architecture at that point, without getting into too much detail here. Then we went on to do version 7. There were huge changes in version 7, and the release of version 7 took maybe 4 years behind schedule. But anyway, we started on version 7. At that point, one of the database changes that we made was a whole new index manager with a much improved compression. This guy named Amnon Weissman, who worked in the database group, figured out how to do that. And so we had, for a while, we had version 7.0. While we were working on this new index manager, we had the old one in there as well. So you could pick which index manager you wanted to use when you created an index, old style or new style. The new style one didn't work. So, but we had to use the database for various things. So we kept the old index manager in there. Stupidly, I let Amnon take the old one out when the new one was finished. So we released version 7 with the new index manager, but not the old one. And that caused a big problem, which was to convert from version 6 to version 7, you had to rebuild all your indexes. So the conversion from 6 to 7 could take a huge amount of time, because if you had a significant sized database, then it might take days to run the database conversion. And so there were some customers, Foxwoods being one of them, that wouldn't upgrade from version 6 to version 7 because they couldn't afford the downtime. So they waited years to do the upgrade. Eventually they did, but it was painful. And that was when I instituted the 5-minute rule, which was that you couldn't do anything that would require more than 5 minutes to do the database conversion from 7 to 8. But I wasn't smart enough to keep the old index manager. I let Amnon take it out. So at that point, we added the ability to have after-image extents. Up till version 7, before version 7, you had one AI file. So if you reached the size limit on the AI file or the size of your disk, you had to shut down, back up your AI file, and do AI image new to start a new AI file, and then you could start the server again. So that switching AI files required downtime. So we implemented AI extents for version 7. Word indexes is also part of version 7. That was part of the new index manager that came in 7. Some server improvements to do part of the query processing by selection of parts of the where clause in the server side. And then we started with the dynamic queries with open query. So up to that point, all the query logic in the 4GL was static queries that were resolved by the compiler, which would choose what indexes to use and so forth. With the dynamic queries and open query, those operations got done when you opened the query rather than when you compiled the program. A bunch of database improvements, a lot of internationalization changes to make operating with different character sets much more flexible. I remember Clyde going around on a tour through various countries with a prototype that he demonstrated to partners and customers, say, here's what we're doing, what do you think? And he came back and he said, I got to do this over. But eventually he got it done. At this point, we also did a data server for ODBC. So that allowed 4GL access to other databases through their ODBC drivers. And we also did a ODBC driver for Progress, which we implemented ourselves the first few versions of it, but eventually we farmed that out to another company. So a lot of client changes as well. This is when the graphical user interface stuff came. We had a lot of meetings and arguments over exactly how that should work and what features should be supported and so on. Bunch of 4GL tooling changes, the first debugger, lots of minor 4GL enhancements, the report builder. So parts in red here, that's all part of the user interface changes that were made to support the graphical user interfaces in addition to the character terminal interface. So at that point, we were supporting Windows, which was, I guess it was Windows 3.1 at that point, and Motif. Motif ports were fun because they were all slightly different on the different versions of Unix. And so one of the things we ended up was we took a copy of Motif and did the port ourselves. So we had our own version of Motif that we took to the Unix machines. That was an interesting experience. 94, we came to version 7.3. This was really the first usable professional version 7 release. There were version 7 releases before that, but they had various shortcomings that annoyed people. So we got it working really good in version 7.3. And then a lot of applications ran on 7.3 for a long time after that. Persistent procedures and related changes was a big thing in 7.3, and that was a feature that was really popular with the customers. Then marketing heard about some of the stuff we were doing and got enamored with the objects that you could create in the 4GL. So we had these poor man's objects, which then got into all sorts of ideas about how we could have these components that were objects, then you could sell the components separately from the application, and on and on. Big dreams. Version 8 in 95. Version 8 caused some anger in the development organization, particularly with myself, because product marketing, product management only cared about Windows at that point. And so there was no server release for version 8, just client, just Windows, no Unixes.
Shocking.
Yeah. So eventually we did 8.0b so that we could get servers. So version 8 finally came out on servers. But I was mad for a while after. So all the database stuff that we've been working on didn't get released in 8.0, it got released in 8.0b. So there were a whole bunch of good stuff we did to the database and the 4GL at that point. And so finally people could get access to that. So row ID came in that version. And we needed to do that because the foreign databases had something similar to rec ID, but it was bigger. So Oracle had row IDs that were larger than the 4-byte rec IDs we had in the Progress database. The rec ID in Progress was, under the covers, it was the same thing as an integer, 32-bit integer. But the Oracle row ID and some of the other databases had a byte string that could be longer than 4 bytes. So that's why we made the row ID data type. And that's why those two are different. A bunch of database utility enhancements came in 8.0b. I'm running out of time. SQL enhancements, so I'm going to go a little fast here. ODBC driver improvements. At this point, I had given up on doing our own ODBC driver, and we hired another company to do that. We eventually bought them. They did lots of other stuff besides ODBC drivers. But at that point, we just did ODBC with them. 8.1, we did web speed. So the guys who built the web speed application took a snapshot of the 4GL code and went off and made web speed. The big difference between what we had at that time and what web speed needed was block mode terminals for web browsers. It was just a block mode terminal with pictures. Anyway, so the way that the user interaction happened with web browsers was completely different from how you did it with a terminal where you type on the keyboard and the application gets the keystrokes one at a time as you're typing. But with HTML, that's not how it works. So anyway, so they took web speed, they took the code and made web speed. And then at that point, we also built the first app server. And then the app server evolved quite a bit after that. A bunch of 4GL improvements came there. We had this thing called the Database Replication Toolkit, which was based on the triggers that we supported with the 4GL. So you could use the triggers to do replication by defining a trigger for some field in the database, and then in the code for the trigger, you would move the data to a second database that you had a connection to, because you could connect to more than one database. So you'd connect to the main database and also to the replica, and the trigger would copy the data from one to the other. And the toolkit was designed to make that easy to set up. Version 8. Now we come to Windows 95 support. In version 8.3, we had more server stuff. Database performance improvements was a big thing. Then 98, version 9. Big changes in a lot of things in the product in version 9. Also, we built this thing called Progress Explorer, which was meant to be a database management tool, but it didn't really work all that well for that purpose. So nobody really liked it very much. So a lot of stuff came in version 9. Socket support, XML, dynamic temp tables, Slick Edit. Anybody here use Slick Edit to edit applications? So we got a license to sell copies of Slick Edit with the product, so we integrated it. And then later on, we took it out because the company that we got it from didn't want us to do that anymore. Sonic. We had a Sonic adapter for the 4GL at that point. Dynamics. Anybody here use Dynamics? Yeah, used. Okay, so in 2003, version 10, we changed the product name to OpenEdge. And the reason we did that was because you could search for OpenEdge and get an answer that was close to something you were looking for. So we changed the name for that reason. We also changed the name from 4GL to ABL, which I never went along with. I still refuse to call it that, which is why the sticker on my computer says 4GL. Okay, version 11 in 2011. I'm going to stop here because you guys have all used version 11. You know what's in it, and you know what's in version 12. And the documentation's all available, so there's no need for me to get into details there. But I have a few more things. So I've mentioned a lot of these things. So the first user conference took place in 1988 in Massachusetts, the first American user conference. The first real user conference took place here in Holland. I forget what city it was in, though. Anybody remember? Okay. So Mike and I joined in '89. PSC went public in 1991. We moved from 5 Oak Park to 14 Oak Park in 91 also. In 92, we shipped version 6.3, and also PSC revenue broke the $100 million mark, which was a good thing for the company. The first year of actual revenue was in 1985. It was only $3 million. 95, the Rotterdam Support Center was opened, and that's still in use today. In 95, we acquired this company called Crescent Software. There were a whole bunch of other acquisitions that came after that, which I'm not going to mention. But that was really the first proper acquisition that we did. 97 was the year we drank the Java Kool-Aid, and we did some stupid things. Also, at that time, we we hit $1 billion total revenue for the company from beginning to 1997. So there was a celebration for that, which was, more evidence that the company was successful, and it was. In 1998, sometime, I forget when, Sonic 1.0 shipped, Sonic MQ. We bought code from this company called Ambrosia for $100,000, and that was the basis for what became Sonic. I mean, there was a lot of work done to that code, but that was kind of the seed to that. Some people think we bought Sonic from another company, but we didn't. Sonic was a homegrown product based on something we bought. What else? 2016 is when I retired the second time. In 2013, I was planning to retire, and it was all arranged. And at that point, Mike had been working at BravePoint for quite a while, 10 years maybe. Yeah, so Mike worked for me for a long time at Progress. Then he went off to BravePoint. And then he started pestering me to come work at BravePoint. And I said, nah. So for some period of time, I kept saying no. And then when I was getting ready to retire, he asked me again, and I finally said, well, okay, I'll do it. I'm getting ready to retire in early October, and I need a couple of months off, and then I'll come. So that was the plan. I was going to go join BravePoint in 2013 after I retired. On September 30th, 2013, Mike calls me and tells me, oh, Progress is buying us.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
Tomorrow.
So at that point, it didn't make any sense for me to retire and then get rehired 2 months later, so I didn't retire.
But we had the retirement celebration here.
Yeah.
We came to the pub, and everybody got a Gus Retires mug or something like that.
Yeah, right. Okay, last milestone, 2022, Progress moved out of 14 Oak Park.
And sold the buildings.
And sold the buildings. There were 3 buildings that Progress owned at the time. One was the data center, and I forget what was in the other one. And then there was a lot of people in the main building that we first moved into in from 5 Oak Park. 14. Anyhow, so all that stuff got sold off, and what was left moved to Burlington. I've never been in that building, so I have no idea what it's like. Oops. What have I done? There. Okay, so that's the end of my story, and I'm sticking to it. Questions? Yes?
Was there ever a moment that Progress would be bought by another company?
Not
on one of the quizzes, wasn't it?
Yeah. Not in any serious way. There were a few inquiries from some purchasers, but we never were interested in selling. There were rumors, however. One of them was Microsoft was going to buy Progress.
And the stock price jumped.
Yeah, but that made absolutely no sense. What's Microsoft going to do with Progress? That was another rumor. We had actually a good relationship with HP for a long time. They gave us a set of HP workstations for the database group to work on because they wanted us to do a good job on HP machines, so they gave us machines to use.
They gave us developers.
Yeah,
Right, that
Yeah, so there was a couple of guys that were sort of full-time progress support. Any other questions? Yeah. When was the most fun time? There were quite a few fun times, but for me, the most fun times were when the database group was small. So there were a handful of us, and there was a lot of interesting stuff to do, so everybody had opportunities for creativity in our group, which I thought was a lot of fun.
Can I give you mine? So I was in development. My joke is I worked for Gus for 10 years, and then Gus worked for me for 2. And
3.
3? I used to joke that the only thing harder than working for Gus is Gus was a hard person to work for. And why was he hard? Because I'd be struggling with a problem, and I'd be looking at this bug for hours, and I just can't figure it out. I'd go in his office, and I'd explain it to him. He'd go, well, look at this. So he was a hard person to work for, but the only thing harder than working for him was having him work for me. I would say the best time for me was actually when I ran the managed database group, because that's when I had the most customer interaction. Being in development, you didn't really have a lot of customer interaction. Tech support certainly did, but development rarely got involved with customers. And when we got involved with customers, you never thought the product worked. So you had no idea that this product was successful, because the only time you're interfacing with customers is when the database doesn't start, you have corruption, or it's crashing all the time. So when I ended up running the managed database group, that's when I saw the success, and I got to meet a whole bunch of customers and how successful they were, and got to come to all these shows and meet everybody. So for me, that was the best part, which was the last 10 years of my career.
Yeah. Another thing that was fun for me, and still is that from the early 90s on, I got a lot of opportunities to be with customers and talk to customers and find out what they thought about things, and I could explain things in the conference presentations and other interactions I had with customers, and that was a lot of fun for me. I've enjoyed those experiences quite a bit, even when I'm getting yelled at by somebody who's got a problem and is mad. No, other questions? Yeah.
On the first slide, you said history of progress or something like that, part 1.
Yeah.
So that raises a question.
That was why I put it there, so somebody would ask me. So I don't have any plans to do another version of this talk, but there is a part 2, because Progress is continuing on to do things. So there's going to be more history, but we don't know what it is yet. So when we know, then maybe I'll come and tell more stories.
40 years later.
I don't think I'll last 40 more years. Anybody else?
I was just going to say, it's very cool to see all of the things that over time you guys have integrated into through data servers and gateways and all of that.
Yeah.
And how much of any of that tech still stands today. Oracle does. If you look really hard, RDB does hidden in Oracle. Not much else is still around. So
Well, Sybase is still there in SQL Server because Microsoft bought Sybase, edited all the documentation and source code, and changed it to SQL Server. And they've, of course, done a lot of work on it since then, but that was how it started. The first SQL Server release was almost exactly Sybase with no changes.
And I think Progress still has the reputation of being the largest software company based in Massachusetts. And I think a lot of that is because other companies got bought.
Yeah.
And Progress has not got purchased.
So one thing I should mention also is there's a lot of stuff in progress history that I haven't talked about. I didn't talk about all the acquisitions. I haven't talked about people. We had various people that were leaders in the company at different times, and others that have done significant things. And I haven't talked about any of that because there wasn't time. The other thing I haven't talked about is any of the other products. All the product stuff I've talked about, it was all 4GL and database stuff. So there's plenty more story. I just couldn't tell it all in one go. Anybody else have a question? All right. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference and the party.